Hello everyone and welcome back to our sixth video in the Intro to Programming section. In this one we're going to be covering something called for loops, while loops, and do while loops. So as you've guessed, all of these will be loops. Now, starting with our for loop. A for loop is used to execute a block of code a fixed number of times. So the user will choose the starting and the ending value, and it will loop through that block of code as many times as specified. The coding segment will look like this. So you have for a for loop, and then you have an open parentheses, and it takes three parameters. So parameter 1 separated by a semicolon, parameter 2 separated by a semicolon, and parameter 3. Each parameter has a specific task. Now, parameter 1 will only get called the very first time we begin our for loop. So that is the initialization section. Again, this will only get called one time. This portion will only be executed one time. Next is the second parameter. The second parameter is your condition check. This gets checked on every single iteration. So every time that a loop goes through, it executes the code and it goes back up to the top of the for loop. This will get checked on every single iteration. Last is the incrementation portion. So 3 is how it increments to the next number. Now this gets called at the end of the for loop. So it executes the code and then it goes and executes this portion here. Now I understand you might be a little confused on what goes into parameter 1, 2, and 3, but we will give an example of that. So again, we have parameters 1, 2, and 3. The initialization is parameter 1, parameter 2 is our condition check, parameter 3 is our incrementation. So it will look as such. So we have for, so that's our for loop that we're creating, and then our first initialization is we're creating an int I. Now I know that I've said that a naming convention is important and that you never want to just use a single character, but this is an exception. You will see that this is the standard, this is just how it's done when you create a for loop. I mean, you can put int I can be whatever number you ever want it to be, but it's just standard for loops that you always do int I. So ignore what we said about a naming convention earlier. When it comes to for loops, it's just int I, int j, int k, whatever you want it to be. So int I equals 0. This is the initialization. This will only get called the very first time that our for loop is created. So we begin our for loop, int I equals 0. So now I, in this iteration of the for loop, holds the value of 0. The next thing is its check. It's going to check and see if this condition is true. If this condition is true, I is less than 10. In this case, that is true because I is 0. As long as this condition is true, it will execute the block of code. And that condition is our parameter 2, which is our condition check. As long as this returns the statement of true and not false, it will execute the block of code. When this returns the value of false, we break out of our for loop and you do all the code that follows our for loop. And then lastly, we have our incrementation. Incrementation is called at the end of the for loop. So it executes the code in that iteration of the for loop, and then it goes to add another number. So I equals I plus 1. So let's just look at the right side of our equal sign. So I, in this case, is going to be 0 on our first iteration. 0 plus 1 is now the value of 1. So on the next iteration of the for loop, I is now going to equal 1. So on and so forth. So let's walk through it a little bit faster. Int I equals 0, so I holds the value of 0. 0 is less than 10, that is true, so cout I. So it prints the number 0. And then after it executes this, it's going to jump back to its incrementation. So 0 plus 1 equals 1. Now for this next iteration through the for loop, I now equals the value of 1. Now we don't need to do our initialization because that only happens once. So the next thing we're doing is we're checking if 1 is less than 10. That is true. So print it. So now we're printing the value of 1. So now we're here. And then we come and we increment. 1 plus 1 equals 2. Now for the next iteration, I equals 2. So we go and check. 2 is less than 10. So print out 2. And then we increment. So 3 is less than 10. Print 3. Now we increment. 4 is less than 10. So we print 4, increment. 5 is less than 10. So we print, then we increment. 6 is less than 10. Print, increment. 7 is less than 10, print increment. 8 is less than 10, print increment. 9 is less than 10, and then we increment. And now I equals 10. So then it comes to do its check, and it says 10 is less than 10. That is now a false statement. So because this is false, it will not execute the print statement, and it will break out of the for loop. And now our for loop is completed, and it's going to continue doing all the rest of the code at the bottom. So again, let's walk through our initialization, our condition check, and our incrementation. So we're telling the loop to start at I equals 0. And then for our condition check, we're checking if I is less than 10. And then for our incrementation, adding 1 to the value of I. And then we're starting all over again until the condition is met, until this condition returns false. So here's the same loop we had as before, except now it's doing something just a little bit different. And if we look to the right side here, we notice that our incrementation looks different. It used to be I equals I plus 1. Now, there's a little fun tool in C++ where if you just do I plus plus, that is the same exact thing as I equals I plus 1. So if you ever see the plus plus at the end of something, it's just taking that and it's going to increment it by 1. So that's pretty simple. So this is how a for loop will pretty much always look for the remainder of our time. It will be a for int I equals 0, and then this is where things change. The condition to exit your for loop will change from time to time, and it will vary. So in this instance, I want it to execute 10 times. So I'm starting at 0, and its last print will be at 9. So from 0 through 9, that's 10 iterations. So let's walk through it one more time. So first we have I equals 0. 0 is less than 10, that's true, and then we'll increment it at the end. 0 times 0 equals 0. So it's printing 0, and then I inputted a space here. So 0 and then a space. Next, I equals 1. 1 is less than 10. 1 times 1 equals 1. And then we increment. And now 2 is less than 10. That is true. 2 times 2 equals 4. So here's our 4. And then we do it with 3. 3 times 3 is 9. 4 times 4 is 16. 5 times 5 is 25. 6 times 6 is 36. 7 times 7 is 49. 8 times 8 is 64. So we just did 8. Now we're back up here and it's 9. 9 is less than 10. That is true. 9 times 9 is 81. Then we increment. Now I equals 10. So we go and we check. 10 is less than 10. That is false. So again, we break out of this loop and we execute all the code after. And our output would be the following here. So again, reiterating what we already did, we're telling the loop to start at I equals 0. We are checking if I is less than 10, and then we are adding 1 to the value of I, and just so you guys already know, I plus plus is the same as I equals I plus 1. And then we're starting over until the condition is met. That is our for loop. Next, we have a while loop. This is used to execute a block of code while the condition is true. So as long as this condition turns out to be true, then all of this code will be executed continuously until this condition becomes false. So it will loop through the block of code as many times as the condition remains true. Oh, and of course, parameter 1 is our condition check, and that would be the condition check within. So let's do int user input num equals 0. So we just created a variable and we assigned it to 0. And what it says is while user input num, which is 0, is greater than 0. That's going to be false. 0 is not greater than 0. This would not return true. This would return false. So this while loop will never execute any code because the condition will return false. So because its very first check returns false, this code will never be executed. Now let's go and check the same while loop. Same exact thing, the only difference is greater than or equal to 0. And of course, our user input num is 0, so while 0 is greater than or equal to 0, this will return true because it is equal to. So now this code will be executed. So it tells the user to enter a number, and I'm telling them that, hey, -1 is how to exit this while loop. As long as the user inputs a positive number, this will continue. So enter any number. So let's say the user inputs 25. So now user input value equals 25. So we go back up to our while loop. 25 is greater than or equal to 0. That is true. So it will ask again. Enter any number. Again, so now they enter 6. So now 6 comes up. 6 is greater than or equal to 0. Awesome. Enter any number. Now they enter 20. 20 is greater than or equal to 0. So now we execute this again. Enter any number, and now they enter -1. -1 is greater than or equal to 0. That is false because it is less than. So now this will no longer execute any of the code, and it will go and execute the following code after our while loop. So as long as this condition is true, then the code it'll execute the block of code. When it becomes false, it breaks out of the loop. Now we have something called a do-while loop. It is just like a while loop. The only difference is it executes the block of code first and then checks its while statement for all follow-on iterations. So a do-while loop will always execute the block of code once, and then after its first execution, then it will check its parameter to see for any follow-on executions. So this is used to execute a block of code once and then check if the condition is true. It will loop through the block of code as many times as a condition remains true. So again, it will automatically do it once, and then at the end it will check its condition for its second iteration and third iteration and fourth and fifth until the condition becomes false, and then it breaks out of it. So here's an example. We did the same thing as before. So int user num or user input num equals 0. And then we do a do while loop. So we're telling the user to enter any number, -1 to exit, and then we're telling the user to input their number into user input num. And it's saying while user input num is greater than 0. So as long as they enter a number greater than 0, then it will continue to do this block of code. So let's say that the very first input the user does is a -1. So it'll come in, it'll do the do, and then it'll enter any number, user inputs -1, and then it checks that -1 is greater than 0, that is false, so it does not execute this do while loop a second time. It only executes on the first iteration, and then the condition is not met, so it breaks out of the loop and does the next following segment of code. Okay, now I want to talk about a little bit of this importance of a for loop versus a while loop. Technically speaking, a for loop can do everything that a while loop can do. It just isn't meant to be that way. And I gave a for instance of how it can do exactly that. So, as we know, the for loop has 3 parameters. Parameter 1, followed by a semicolon, parameter 2, followed by a semicolon, and then parameter 3. In this instance, I do not have a parameter 1, and I do not have a parameter 3. All I'm doing is I'm making my second parameter the condition check, which would then make it the same exact loop as this while loop here. So it's saying, enter a number, -1 to exit. And so as long as they enter a positive number, or 0, it will continue in this loop. The way that we break out of this for loop is when they enter a negative number, a number less than 0. So let's say they enter the number 6. So we begin our for loop, enter a number, they enter 6. Now it's coming back up to the top of the loop, and it says 6 is greater than or equal to 0. That is true. So then we do it again. Enter a number. Now they enter 20. 20 is greater than or equal to 0. And then they enter a -5. So they enter a number, -5. -5 is greater than or equal to 0. That is false. We break out of our for loop. And then again, we do the same exact thing as we had before, but now for our while loop. So this is very uncommon for a for loop to not have your first parameter and not have your third parameter. But I just wanted to show you guys how how versatile the for loop can be. You don't have to have an initialization portion, which is your first parameter of a for loop. It's not an absolute requirement right here. But when you want to use your for loop the proper way, then yes, you do need to put something here, and you need to put your incrementation here. So I want to show you an example of how things happen both ways. So I hope that makes sense. And now we'll get into the coding portion of our for loop and our while loop. And again, we want to end every slide end every PowerPoint with you guys seeing the resources that you guys have available. If you have any questions, again, I'm begging you, please reach out. We're here to help. I don't want you guys sitting on problems for too long. Okay, now we're going to get into our coding portion. And again, I wiped my folder clean because it's going incredibly slow on my computer. Every time I'm doing a screen recording, it takes its sweet time compiling. So this is 1.6, and let's call it loops. Finish. And then we'll just call it loops.cpp. Source file loops.cpp. Now let's go through and let's do our input-output library. So we want to include input-output library. Int main is used to begin the program. Then let's create variables. Create variables, and then ask user to guess my favorite number. And then after that, we will check if the number inputted is too high, low, or just right. Then we'll return. So let's do our return the value of 0 to end the program. We'll start with that. And as inputted maybe only has one T. Yeah. Now let's get into our coding portion. So we go pound include IOStream, and then we're going to be using namespace standard. And now let's get into our int main. And right here, I'm actually going to save build because I want to get rid of this squiggly we get under the std in the beginning. There we go. Now it won't give us any errors. But let's copy and paste all of this, and let's put it inside of our main. And then we want to return 0 to end our program. So let's create variables. So let's create two integers. Int user input, and I'll just initialize it to 0, and then int my fav num equals 620. 620. Okay. So ask the user to guess my favorite number. So let's put this in a while loop. While the user input does not equal my fav num, then we will continue everything. We will continue inside of this while loop. So let's check so far. While user input, which is 0, does not equal 620, which is true. 0 is not 620. This will return true, and we will execute the code inside of our while loop. So now let's do a cout guess my favorite number. Go. And L. And then we will grab an input cin. And my fav, oh whoops, we don't want to overwrite my fav number, we want the user's input. User input. Now let's check if the number is too high, too low, or just right. So take our comments, put it here. Now let's do some checking. If the user input is greater than my fav num, so if it's greater, then that means that they are too high. So too high, comma, try again, exclamation points. And then we'll do an end L. So because I'm only doing one line of code in my if statement, I do not need to do curly braces. I could, if I wanted to, make it look as like that. So I have curly braces to start and end my if statement. But because I'm only doing one line of code, that is not needed. so I will not do it for now. And now, after my if, let's do an else if. And now we're going to do user input is less than my fav num. And then we will do a cout too low, comma, try again. Bunch of exclamation points. End L. And then, oh, need to close it with a semicolon. And then we do an else statement. And again, we do not need to do curly braces. So for our else statement, this is, so if it's not above it, if it's not below it, then that means they guessed it. So cout, correct. You guessed correctly. And then we close it, and then we do an end L. And let's give them some exclamation points at the end of you guessed correctly. And we have an end L, end it with a semicolon. Okay, so let's walk it through from the top. So our user input is 0. Our favorite number is 620. While the user input, which in this first iteration is 0, does not equal my favorite number of 620, which is true, they do not equal, then we're telling the user to guess my favorite number. Go, and we're taking the user input. Let's say the user inputs 100. What it's going to do is it's going to go and check. Is 100 greater than 620? That is false. So it does not execute the code, and it goes to the next check. Else, if 100 is less than 620. That is true. This line of code will be executed. It will say too high, try again. And now, because this is executed, we can ignore the else statement, and then we go back up to the top of the while loop. Now, user input holds the value of 100. 100 does not equal 620. That is true. So now we're telling the user to guess a second time. So now they're guessing another number. Guess my favorite number. But now they know that 100 is too low. So now they can just play the bracket game of they know the high, they know the low, cut it in the middle. They know the high, they know the low, cut it in the middle. And they can continue to do that until they guess the number. And all of that is done in our while loop. So that is the end of our while loop. Everything in this segment here is our while loop. Once they guess the number correctly, we will break out of the while loop. Now let's go ahead and use the for loop. So a for loop. Let's populate an array of dog names. So some things we have to do before that. Now we need to create some variables. So let's create more variables. And let's create the size of the array. So int num of dog names, and let's make it equal to 10. So we have 10 dog names. Now let's create an array. And it's going to be a string array because it's going to hold dog names. So string dog names, and the size will be num of dog names. And now we created it. So I created a string array of, and we're titling it dog names, and it holds a total of 10 values inside of our array. Now we need to populate our array. So how are we going to populate it? We're going to use a for loop. For int I equals 0, I is less than num of dog names, I plus plus. And now we're going to use curly braces because we're going to put multiple lines in our for loop. So we're going to tell them to enter dog name for index, and it's going to be at index I. And then I'll do a period, and then end L. So we're telling them enter the dog name for index I, and so it's going to start off at index 0, and it's going to go all the way up to index 9. That will be the last index where this condition is still true. So now let's ask for the user's input. So we're going to do a get line, cin, and we want it to store into dog names. And what index do we want it to store to? We want it to store into index I. That way, the dog names is going to add itself every single time. So the first time it's going to store it into index 0 of dog names. The next time it's going to store it into index 1, and then index 2, and then index 3, and index 4, and index 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then it will not do it the 10th time because that condition will return false. Okay, so that is us populating an array of dog names. Now let's print the dog names in the array. Again, for loop, for int I equals 0, I is less than num of dog names I plus plus, and again we want to do curly braces. And just to reiterate, I know you guys heard this in the PowerPoint, but it doesn't hurt to say it twice. You are separating these conditions by a semicolon, not a comma. So int I equals 0, and then a semicolon. I is less than num of dog names, semicolon, and then I plus plus. So another thing that I want to just reiterate, I know we covered it, and it's about scope. So int I equals 0. This int I exists only in between these curly braces because that's the scope within this int I. Once we reach this end curly brace right here, and we move on to the next line of code right there, int I is destroyed, which means the int I variable doesn't exist anymore, and it's free to be used again. So it's free to be used right here. So that's something to note. But let's just say, and I'm going to delete this, but let's just say I go and create int I right here. Now int I exists outside of the scope. So now I could go like that, int I, and now there's going to be an error right here, or it's going to actually reassign I to 0, but I exists outside of this scope right here because I was created within this massive scope here. So I'm going to delete that, but I just wanted to show you guys about scope. So we're going to get rid of our int I, and I'm going to go over here and I'm going to create int I. So again, this int I in the first for loop will only exist in between these blocks of code. Once we're done with our for loop, this int I is destroyed and it's freed up to be used again. Now let's jump back over here. Now we are printing everything within this, within our array. So we're using a for loop to print all the items that we have in our array. So let's see out, and we'll say index, quotes, index, space, index I, and we're going to say, and I want to do a space, hold, or lowercase, holds the dog name of, and then endl. So because it is just one line of code, I do not need the curly braces. So I just want to show you guys that. Do not need the curly braces. And then let's get rid of all of our spacing here. So it looks good. Okay, now let's walk through this. Before we execute it, let's walk through our logic. So I'll put some spacing here just so you guys understand that this segment is completely different from this segment. They do two different things. So let's walk through the first portion. So again, we have a user input that I just initialized to 0. We have my favorite number of 620. And we're continuously asking the user, as long as these numbers do not match. Again, if they do not match, then we're going to continuously take a new guess from the user. We're then going to check if it's too high. We're then going to check and then if it's not too high, we're going to check if it's too low. If it's not too high or too low, that means they guessed it correctly. If they guessed it correctly, now this condition here, when it goes back up to the top, it's going to say 620 does not equal 620. That's going to be false. So because it's false, we break out of this entire while loop. So we're done with the while loop, and now we go to these lines of code to be executed. So we've guessed the number correctly. Now we're down to our second portion. So we have int number of dog names is 10. Then we create an array of dog names holding 10 dog names. And now we're asking for user input. So populate an array of dog names. So we are starting at the value of 0, ending at the value of 9, and we're asking the user to enter the dog name for that given index. And then we are using a get line. Only reason I'm using a get line is because, you know, maybe they want to, maybe people give their dogs their own last name. You know, I wanted to make this as versatile as possible. So if someone were to put, you know, Hank Jr., and let's say those are two different names, Hank space Jr., I don't know. Whatever people like to put for their dog names, I just want to make it as versatile as possible so it fit the most amount of conditions. But let's think about this. Up here, I'm using a cin. Down here, I'm using a get line. So you know what we need to add. we need to, because I'm going from cin to get line, I need to clear the buffer. The way I do that is cin.ignore, open parenthesis, close parenthesis, semicolon. So cin.ignore, we clear the buffer, and then we are asking for their dog names. We are having it set. Yeah, we're having it set to 10. Int I is 0, I is less than 10, so this will go through 9 different times. Each time it is writing to a different index because our index changes. So the first index will be index 0, the second input will be saved to index 1, and then index 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And it will not store into the 10th index because this condition is false. And on top of it, we don't have a 10th index because it goes from 0 to 9, which is our 10 inputs. And then we do the same thing here, but this time instead of collecting the inputs, we are just printing it back to the user. Except I did not give an opportunity to print the item. So let's do that right now. And we are calling it dog names, and it's at index I. So index I holds the dog name of, and then dog names of index I. So it's going to print what we have stored in index 0, dog names index 0, and then index 1 and 2. It's going to do that all the way up to 9. So let's save it. Let's build it. And let's run it. And that was actually fast. Okay. Guess the favorite number. So let's start with 1,000. Too high, try again. So now let's go 500. Too low, so it's in between 500 and 1,000. So we're going to go 750. Too high, so it's in between 500 and 750. So 625. Too high, so it's in between 500 and 625. So go 575, or we'll just go 600. Too low, so it's in between 600 and 625, so we'll go 615. Too low, and we'll end with 620. I know this is correct. Enter. Correct. You guessed correctly. Thank you very much. Enter the dog name for index 0. Okay, dog name for index 0, we're going to go with Maui. Enter the dog name for index 1. We'll go with Rye. Dog name for index 2, we'll do Ella. Index 3, we'll go Capone. Index 4, we'll go Ryder. Index 5, we'll go Dubs, or Dublin. 6, we'll go with Abby. 7, we will go with Mate. 8, we will go with Dude. 9, I'll do something with a space. We'll go Mama's Dog. Mama's Doggy. Bunch of exclamation points. Now, after I press enter, that now is going to end the last loop of our for loop here. It is then going to print all of these. So it's going to execute this block of code 10 times, each time printing a different index for I, and it's going to also go and grab a different item within the dog's name array. So let's go over here and hit enter. So index 0 holds the dog name of Maui, index 1 holds the dog name of Rye, index 2 Ella, index 3 Capone, index 4 Ryder, index 5 Dublin, index 6 Abby, index 7 Mate, index 8 is Dude, and index 9 is Mama's Doggy. Okay, so again, we covered a while loop in here. We showed that there is conditions for the while loop. As long as this condition is true, it executes all the blocks of code within our while loop. Once this condition is false, we are done with our while loop and we do the code after. And then for our for loop, again, a for loop is used to do a certain number of iterations. So both of these for loops execute 10 times. So execute 10 times, executes 10 times. The first time we're populating, and the second time we are printing. So that's an example of a while loop, a for loop, and some small condition checks. I hope this all made sense, and I'll see you guys in the next video, which is where things will start to get complex, and we're going to be doing something called functions. Hope to see you over there.